The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years, not only is the Prime Minister not worth the cost, he still does not have a climate plan. He said that if Canadians paid his carbon tax, it would save the world, but here are the facts. Canada now ranks 58th out of 63 in climate action. Canada is the only G7 country not to have reduced its emissions below 1990 levels. The Prime Minister has missed 7 of 8 of his targets over the last decade. And finally, according to a bombshell report by his own Environment Commissioner this week, he will not hit his 2030 Paris Accord targets. Mr. Speaker, why won't the Prime Minister just admit he doesn't have a climate plan, he has a tax plan?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is saying in this House is factually incorrect. Facts. We have the best performance in terms of greenhouse gas reduction since 2019, Mr. Speaker. Fact. We have a plan that has been applauded by environmental organization, research organization, municipalities, even oil companies have applauded our climate plan, Mr. Speaker. And this morning in the Environmental Committee, the Commissioner to the Environment and Sustainable Development said that not only pollution pricing is working, but it is responsible for 30% of emission reduced in Canada since 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It's funny that he keeps focusing on 2019 and the year that followed, because that year was the only year in which emissions went down because the economy was locked down, Mr. Speaker. In every other of the 8 years this Prime Minister has been in power, he has missed his emissions targets. He now ranks 58th out of 63 nations. He leads the only country in the G7 that has not reduced its emissions below 1990 levels. And his own Environment Commissioner says he will not hit his Paris targets. So, will they finally admit that after 8 years, this carbon tax is all pain and no gain?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, what the Leader of the Opposition is saying is still factually incorrect because we haven't missed any of our targets. The only target we have is for 2030. Canada has missed many targets because for 10 years, the Conservative Party did nothing to fight climate change. They did nothing to support clean energy. They did nothing to support electrification of transportation. They did nothing on adaptation, Mr. Speaker. That's why Canada has been missing our targets. This government, this Prime Minister, we will meet our targets. We're 85% to our 20 targets already, Mr. Speaker.
From Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this government's record on climate change is in. The opening sentence of the Environment Commissioner's report says it all. The federal government is not on track to meet the 2030 target. It's now clear the government's environmental plan is a mishmash of regulations and taxes that aren't working. And it's not just clear to the Commissioner, it was also clear to COP27, where Canada was ranked 58 out of 63 countries for climate change performance. Change starts with acknowledging failure. Will the government?
The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it quite ironic that this member campaigned for the leadership of his party on a carbon taxing platform, Mr. Speaker. And now all of a sudden it doesn't work. He doesn't believe in it. Well, this morning the Commissioner to the Environment and Sustainable Development was at the Environment Committee, and this is what he said. He said that not only our pollution pricing is working, but it is responsible for up to 30% of emission reduced in Canada since 2019, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to talk about climate change because they don't want to talk about the fact that they're buddying up with their friends in the big oil companies, and God forbid that we would do anything to affect their profits. We want to fight climate change, and we want to help Canadians in the process, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Speaker, I campaign on a revenue-negative carbon tax. This government's environmental plan is revenue positive and a mishmash of taxes and regulations which is dragging the Canadian economy down. Emissions still haven't risen to pre-pandemic highs, and that's because the economy still hasn't recovered. Per capita GDP and productivity are lower this year than in 2017. After 8 years, will the government admit that its environmental plan isn't working, its economic plan isn't working, with productivity and per capita GDP lower today than 6 years ago?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from these conservatives, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I'm surprised about, not only do they not have a climate plan, they don't even have an economic plan, Mr. Speaker. Their only plan is to cut services, cut investment, cut programs in Canada. Mr. Speaker, I have some piece of good news for you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the OECD ranked Canada third in the world for foreign investment attraction, Mr. Speaker. Our plan is working. We're creating prosperity. We're creating jobs. We're building Canada of the 21st century.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
They can huff and they can puff, but their carbon tax house is falling down because it was built on two pillars which have completely collapsed. The first, that it is revenue neutral. Well, the Prime Minister's own budget watchdog has said that Canadians pay far more in the tax than anything they hope to receive. The second is that it would allow the government to hit their own emissions targets. Well, the Liberal-appointed Environment Commissioner confirmed this week that they have no hope of hitting their targets even with the carbon tax. So after 8 years of failure, will the Prime Minister put his ego aside, admit he has a tax plan, not an environmental plan?
The honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, we're getting there. We're 85% of the way to meeting our 2030 targets.
The honourable Minister from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are getting there. We're 85% of meeting our 2030 targets. But do you know what's worse than not even trying? Is not even being willing to admit that climate change exists. Last week, the leader of the opposition was asked in a scrum right over there if he would meet the Paris target. And it was like a deer in front of headlights, Mr. Speaker. He couldn't even answer the question as to whether or not Canada would meet our Paris target. He wouldn't even answer the question. On this side of the House, we are doing everything we can to achieve our 2030 targets, as opposed to the Conservative Party, who want to bring us back to the Stone Age, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
His own government has admitted that they're not going to hit those targets, Mr. Speaker. And they're getting there? Does somebody have a participation trophy we could send across the way? Maybe they would get there faster if they stopped saying no to clean energy projects, like when they killed a tidal electricity project in Atlantic Canada that would have created zero emissions power for Canadians, or when they say no to nuclear, when they say no to carbon capture. There were 18 LNG terminals on the books when this Prime Minister took office. 0 have been completed. Right. So instead of canceling clean energy projects, why don't they cancel their carbon tax?
The honourable member for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As is too frequently the case in this House, the member is just factually wrong. At the end of the day, the previous Conservative government got almost nothing built, including 0 LNG facilities, because it actually gutted the environmental assessment process. It paid no heed to environmental impacts. It did not have a climate plan. At the end of the day, we have put in place measures to ensure that we are going to see good projects go ahead going forward, including offshore wind in Atlantic Canada, battery manufacturing plants in Bécancour, the Volkswagen electric vehicle plant, Air Products hydrogen plant, and a whole range of other things. You have to have a climate plan if you want to have an economic plan. You have neither.
L'honorable député de Joliette.